Welcome. This lecture is entitled The British Conquest of New France. It was a heroic attempt to build a flourishing colony on the St. Lawrence River. However, after 150 years, economic development was too modest for the emergence of meaningful merchant activity. Guided by the feudalistic thinking of France, New France had slow economic and population growth. By 1755, the French numbered about 60,000, whereas England's colonies in America had a population of 2 million. The ratio was 33 to 1. When the British and French went to war in the mid-1750s, the odds were in favor of the British having the upper hand in North America. The French were strong in the wilderness with the alliances with native people, but once the British conquered the French settlements on the St. Lawrence River, France lost its hold on North America. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict that took place in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America. In North America, the 7 Years' War merged with a conflict already underway named the French and Indian War. The French in North America had their hands full with the British. New France was hampered by military shortcomings when Britain formally declared war on France in 1756. The logistics were a weakness. The French had an overextended line of forts between Louisburg and Ohio. The French-Canadian militia lost some of its guerrilla warfare skills of the past, and there was a rift between French Canadians and troops from France. Outnumbered on the continent by the British, the French depended heavily on the support of Indian allies. Despite their disadvantages, the French did score early victories. British General Edward Braddock, whose goal was to capture Fort Duquesne in 1755, was ambushed by the French and their native allies. The British, who slowly marched across the country, were sitting ducks for the ambush. Approximately two-thirds of Braddock's men were killed or wounded, and Braddock himself succumbed to his wounds. In the summer of 1756, a combination of French regular troops, French-Canadian militia, and Indian allies captured Fort Oswego. The following year, the French captured Fort William Henry. When the French permitted the defeated British soldiers to leave peacefully, the natives who fought with the French did not accept this arrangement. They hunted down the retreating British, killing 200 of them. The governor of New France, Pierre de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil, wanted the French to attack nearby Fort Edward, but General Louis Joseph Marquis de Montcalm refused. This was the high point of French military success. British statesman William Pitt committed the British to go all out. The war was characterized as a patriotic crusade. The nation was at the early stage of the Industrial Revolution that would generate great wealth for the nation. There were signs of a powerful mix of entrepreneurialism, industry, and creativity. Evidence of its growing economic power Britain generated and borrowed the necessary revenue to finance a successful campaign in North America. Hampered by an efficient feudal mercantilist economy, France could not match British accumulation of capital. France was also at a psychological disadvantage since various leaders in France argued that New France was covered with ice 8 months a year and was not worth defending. In New France, the French Canadians thought otherwise, but they experienced increasingly difficult times. Food and supply shortages were chronic, and there was widespread hunger and poverty among the people. Crop failures in 1756 and 1757 worsened the conditions, as did corruption. For example, there was the perception of Francois Bigot, the Intendant, had reserved supplies of beef for himself and his friends. He never lost his reputation as a corrupt official, and historian Desmond Morton claims that the gross corruption of Bigot doomed the colony. On the matter of the military, discord between French Canadian and French troops became more serious. General Montcalm was upset with Governor Vaudreuil, a French Canadian. The governor believed that Montcalm treated the French Canadians too harshly. On military strategy, Vaudreuil encouraged the French to go on the offensive, but Montcalm wanted to maintain a defensive position on the St. Lawrence. In Europe, the British Navy was successful in containing the French. Thus, the prospects for French victory were bleak when the British prevented French ships from reaching North America. On the East Coast, there were 8,000 men stationed at Fort Louisbourg, but the invading English force consisted of 20,000 soldiers and seamen. The French could only hold on for 7 weeks before surrendering. The British also scored victories on the western flank in 1758. Fort Duchesne, Fort Oswego, and Fort Frontenac fell to British forces. In the case of Fort Duchesne, the French destroyed their fort knowing they could not defeat the British. The British built on the site and named it after William Pitt. It was the start of Pittsburgh. The French forced the British back at Ticonderoga, but this small victory seemed trivial in the bigger picture of the British controlling the eastern and western flanks of North America. The only major holdout was Quebec. In the summer of 1759, the British invasion force of 200 ships carrying 9,000 soldiers and over 2,000 seamen made its way up the St. Lawrence under the command of 32-year-old General James Wolfe. Another James, James Cook of later exploration fame, sailed ahead and marked a route with boys through the dangerous narrow channel. Due to French miscalculations, the British gained access to the island of Orleans and set up their cannons across the river on the levee heights. The French defenders had approximately 14,000 troops and militia in good position in and around Quebec, but they had failed to secure the south bank. From the south bank of the river, less than a kilometer away, the British bombarded the lower town with cannons. The British attempted to break through Montcalm's defensive line in July without success. The British, however, torched the countryside, destroying over 1,400 homes. At Quebec, there was deadlock throughout August. According to one story, there were no carts available for fortifications at Quebec because they were being used for the construction of a private bomb shelter for Bigot's mistress. The British kept the French guessing by sending soldiers upriver of Quebec. This forced French troops to march and countermarch to the point of exhaustion. In late August, several British ships were successful in sailing up the St. Lawrence past French batteries. Having established a strong naval presence above Quebec, the British devised a new plan of attack. But the clock was running. The invading force had to defeat the French before the cold weather and ice set in. The bold plan was to sail in darkness to a small cove known as Anse au Foulot, which this site, there was a narrow path up a approximately 200-foot cliff that British scouts had discovered. If successful, the climb would put the British on the plains of Abraham, a large grassy field near the French fortifications. It was a gamble. Stakes were high. With good coordination and fortune, the British could draw the French from their defensive position. However, one mistake and the British would be at the mercy of the French with poor chances for a safe retreat down the cliff. On that fateful night, September 12th, ships carrying British troops sailed to the small cove. The French were expecting a convoy of French provision boats to be on the move, and they mistook the British ships for their ships. A French sentry on the shore shouted, "Qui vive?" A French-speaking Scot replied, "France." "De quel régiment?" "De Lorraine," replied the bilingual soldiers. This satisfied the sentry, and there was no alarm. The French had failed to establish a password, and thus the British fooled the French. An advance group of British scaled the cliff and put French sentries to the sword. The area was only lightly guarded because no one imagined that an invasion force could scale the cliff on a tiny path. With the cliff secured, the prearranged signal was given, and as fast as the boats loaded with soldiers emptied, they returned to the anchored ships and to the south shore for reinforcements. Set ashore, 4,500 soldiers scaled the cliff with no resistance. In the early morning of September 13, the French discovered that the British were on the plains of Abraham. It was a shocking turn of events for the British. Behind the British, 15 kilometers away, were 3,000 French soldiers who received word to go to Quebec immediately, but they did not make it in time. Montcalm mobilized 4,500 French regulars and Canadian militia, but he made a military blunder. Rather than waiting for the French reinforcements to show up, he impulsively ordered the attack. The battle was carried out in European fashion, which was an advantage for the well-trained British troops. The French, on the other hand, were composed of French regulars and French Canadian militia, the latter less suited for European battle tactics. The French advanced towards the British, flying regimental colors and cheering "Vive le Roi!" They marched, and not one shot rang out. 3/4 of the British troops were deployed in one line, waiting silently, patiently, until the enemy was 40 meters away. Then the command, "Fire!" rang out, and the muskets crashed in a rolling roar. A second volley followed, but no more were necessary. The ground was covered with French dead and wounded. The British force, including kilted Highlanders, charged the dazed survivors with fixed bayonets and broadswords, shouting wildly. There was confusion among the French, and in less than an hour, the British were victorious. Both leaders, Wolfe and Montcalm, died from wounds. Within a week, Quebec fell to the British. The loss of Quebec was the beginning of the end for the French, but they did not give up. The remaining army was intact with control of most of the St. Lawrence River Valley. French commander Chevalier de Lévis defeated the British in a battle at St. Foy, and they besieged Quebec and waited for reinforcements from France. They never came because the French fleet was virtually destroyed in Europe. The ships that did come flew British rather than French flags. The French had to retreat. Within 1 year of the Plains of Abraham, the French lost Montreal and thus North America. French possession of Canada was history. From 1760 to 1763, the British ruled Quebec by direct military occupation. The British faced three major issues. The French were Roman Catholic, whereas the British were Protestant. French-Canadian society had been organized by way of a feudal absolutist rule, whereas the British represented a constitutional monarchy. And the French had strong alliances with natives. The key point was that the British now governed French Catholics who had no understanding of British politics and traditions. The Treaty of Paris officially finalized the transfer of New France to England. The Proclamation of 1763 had three key components. First, there was the creation of the province of Quebec. Second, land north and west of rivers draining in the Atlantic, excepting the Hudson Bay Company territory, became an Indian territory. No settlement was permitted in this Indian territory, and trade was only for those with a license. In essence, a large tract of the continent was made into a closed reserve under the control of the imperial authorities. Third, the governance of Quebec was by a governor and council to be followed by an elected assembly. The first governor of Quebec was James Murray, who hoped to assimilate the French and have them adopt Protestantism and British law. The policy of assimilation failed. The overwhelming majority of French Canadians lived in rural regions. There was little exposure to British ways, and the habitants continued to embrace much of their traditions. Moreover, few British were willing to settle in Quebec, particularly since the 13 colonies not only offered better climate, but also greater economic opportunities. Due to the small number of British in Quebec, and because British law did not allow Catholics to hold public office, there were no elections held for an assembly. There were other shortcomings to the proclamation of 1763. Fur trade alliances and relations with the natives deteriorated. The proclamation failed to tackle the issues of French language, religion, and land tenure. And the 13 colonies were upset with the proclamation, especially since it limited their westward movement. For Americans, the Quebec Act of 1774 was even worse. The Quebec Act represented some advances for the French. They were given permission to practice their religious beliefs, and the church regained the right to collect tithes. The act supported the seigneurial system and allowed Catholics to hold office, providing they took an oath of loyalty. The Quebec Act established a legislative council as the governing body, and it allowed a dual judicial system where both British criminal law and French civil law was accepted. Finally, the Quebec Act increased the territory of Quebec. The impact of the Quebec Act was mixed. The French clergy and the seigneurs benefited, and they were pleased. British merchants liked the idea of increased fur trading area, but they were upset that there was still no assembly. Most French Canadians were indifferent to the Quebec Act. It did not alter their lives. Those who were the most upset were American colonists. They found the legislation too favorable to the Catholic French, and the geographical boundaries were too restrictive, hemming them in along the eastern seaboard. The British policymakers appear to be unaware that the Quebec Act would help drive the 13 colonies to open revolt. To conclude, as was the case in most conflicts elsewhere in the mid-1700s, the British scored victory against the French in North America. In France, there was significant indifference to the plight of New France. Philosopher Voltaire dismissed Canada as, quote, several acres of snow, and many officials agreed that the rewards of New France were few considering the cost. Globally, victory in the 7 Years' War placed Britain in a position to dominate world trade for the foreseeable future. But what of their possession in North America? In the short term, the task of the British was to make their new province of Quebec a success, even though the overwhelming French Catholic population had no or little understanding of British culture, economics, and politics. Thank you.